Evening, everyone who had joined us today. This session is about above and beyond with calculation groups in Power BI in terms of the diverse use cases that you can do, that you can facilitate with Power BI. Um, when I'm presenting this session, I'm also assuming that you guys do have a very basic knowledge in Power BI as well. If not, it's completely fine. You can always listen in, and in case if you guys come across any problems, you guys are free to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to help you guys out. Uh, Either ways, in this session, I'll be going through some basics as well, so you guys should be fine off. Right. So for those who don't know me, I'm Timante Vidanagamke. I love working with Microsoft Data Platform technologies such as Microsoft Power BI, Azure Analysis Services, Azure Data Factory, and so on. The most important thing out of all the details that you see in the screen right now is my Twitter handle at TimantaB. So please do follow me in Twitter at TimantaB. Moving into the agenda for today, we'll firstly look at some basics of calculation groups, and later on we'll be looking at the diverse use cases that can be facilitated with the calculation groups, which would wrap up my session. Right. So firstly, it's important for us to know what calculation groups are. So calculation groups is a feature in DAX that allows you to minimize the redundant measures with the same calculation, logic, expression, and whatever you may call it. Uh, Primarily, these calculation groups are used for time intelligence, but that is not the only use case that these calculation groups are used for. Uh, the reason why I'm doing this session is to shed some light on those other use cases you can use calculation groups for as well. So that is pretty much the motive of this session, and that is where this session is coming from. And in terms of the platforms that you can use calculation groups with, you can use calculation groups with Power BI, Azure Analysis Services, and SQL Server Analysis Services. In Power BI, you should use an external tool called Tabular Editor to use calculation groups. But when it comes to Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server Analysis Services, this feature is actually inbuilt those platforms. So you guys don't need to use any kind of external tools to simply work it out. So yeah, so as I told you previously, in Power BI, we would be using Tabular Editor. We'll have to use an external tool called Tabular Editor to use calculation groups. And it's not the case if you are using any other platform such as Azure Analysis Services or SQL Server Analysis Services. And also when it comes to when it comes to uh, I'm sorry, when it comes to the components of Power BI, there are components of calculation groups. There are two key components that you need to keep in mind in terms of calculation groups. Uh, Firstly, you have the calculation group, which stores something called calculation items. And next up, we have the calculation items, which actually store the logic that are required to work things out with the calculation groups. Now, if you guys don't get these components, when I verbally do say it, it's completely fine because I'll be going through these calculation groups in a bit more detail, so that with demos in which you which would really help you guys to understand these components much better. Right. Now we do have a very basic knowledge in the calculation group in terms of what it is supposed to do and what this session is supposed to do and the platforms that you can actually use these calculation groups with. Now it's time for us to head into an example and to see where these calculation groups actually fit in. Right, so let's think of a data model and you have two key base measures in a data model in a specific, let's say, a sales data model, which are sales amount and sales quantity. So these are the two key base measures in this data model, and all the analytics does happen with this particular, with these two measures. Now, as the time goes and as the users are actually consuming this data model, uh, after a while, a requirement comes by saying that they do want to do last year analytics with these sales amount and sales quantity measures as well, which means that they want to see with the current year sales amount, or with the current year sales amount, they do also want to see the last year sales amount and the sales quantities for their respective analytical purposes to compare the performance between, compare how the things have changed with respect to the last year and this year. For that purpose, they want the last year and they want the last year metrics. So they want to engage in the last year analytics. So in that case, before calculation groups came into play, this kind of a requirement was fulfilled by creating two additional measures to cater these last year requirements, right? So you do have the sales amount and the sales quantity base measures, and those base measures would be referring to two new measures for saying last year sales amount and the last year sales quantity, which would give you the figures, the last year figures for the sales amount and sales quantity. Now, with calculation groups, that is not the right way to go about things anymore. You don't want to create additional logic. You don't want to repeat additional logic, or you don't want to create additional measures in order to cater these kind of requirements. How you would do it with calculation groups is that you would have the base measures, and the base measures can be referred to a single calculation group, which is called time intelligence in this case. And that particular calculation group will have the last year logic that is actually replicating in each of the which was replicating as per the previous solution. And that would have the common logic in it. The calculation group item would have the calculation item last year would have the common logic in it. And what would happen is that when the user wants to see the last year's sales amount, they would refer to the base measure sales amount, and they would be able to get the last year's sales amount with reference to the time intelligence calculation group. And if they want to see the last year's sales quantity, they would refer to the base measure last year's sales quantity, and they would be able to get the last year's sales quantity by referring to the same time intelligence calculation group. Right. So that's pretty much how you cater this kind of a requirement with calculation groups. So if you go back to the old solution, which was before calculation groups came into play, you can see that you have two measures, last year's sales amount and last year's sales quantity. Now keep in mind the logic, only the base measure is the difference between these two additional measures, right? The logic other than that is typically the same. I would showcase that to you in the demo, but that is actually what happens. But if you head back to the calculation group, you don't have any repeating logic. Or the repeating logic is not repeating. You have the logic stored in one single place inside a calculation item in the calculation group, and you would be referring to the base measure sales amount and sales quantity as per your preference, typically as per your analytical preference. So that is pretty much how these calculation groups work out. Right, without further ado, to showcase this exact use case, I would like to get back into the I would like to get back into a demo and show you this exact use case that I just explained, which is related to last year's sales amount and last year's sales quantity. So to say that, we would head back into our Power BI environment. So I have a Power BI desktop file open in my end, and I would make sure that I do share that. there you go. Right, so this is my Power BI desktop file. Let me see if I can get more space and make it look a bit better. Right, I guess that's fine. So this is typically my Power BI desktop file. And this particular desktop file, you can see the two base measures created in the old-fashioned way, which is before the calculation groups came into play. You can see the last year's sales amount measure, sales quantity measure, and also the last year's sales amount measure. And if you typically drag and drop the last year's sales, last year's sales quantity for this particular table, you can see that it would show up as well. And I would like to bring in the last sales quantity in as well. And that is how it looks like. So you can see, if you look at this particular visual, which is a very basic table, you can see the last year's sales amount and last year's sales quantity, right? Typically year-wise. So obviously it would be year-wise. And if you look at, and if I take your attention to the last year measures now. So this is typically the output that we got from having the two additional measures, which is the last year sales amount and last year sales quantity. And now what I'd like to do is deep dive or dive into these measures and show you around these measures. So if I head back to the first measure, you can see how I had built the logic for the last year, right? So it's a very basic logic. Uh, uh, it's a very basic logic that I had built here. I had identified the current year or the latest year, and I had simply minus one from that and simply filtered that out uh, with the calculate function. But you can do the same thing with same period last year my function as well, and you can also do the same thing with the previous year function as well. So in this case, I thought of going with this kind of logic because for some reason for this use case the same period last year and the previous year measure did not work, which I believe is because this data model is actually referring to the date key and not the date column. It's actually connected to the calendar table or the date table with the date key, as you can see, which is not a date fill. So as a result of that, the previous year and the same period last year logic did not work out to get the last year figures. So you said this is actually what you see in the screen right now. This logic is the logic that worked out, and I didn't worry about it since this is just a demo and this was sufficient enough for me. Right. And this is typically my logic, last year sales amount, and this is the logic that gets me the last year sales amount. And if I take you back to the last year sales quantity measure, you could see the last year sales quantity measure here as well. And you can literally see it's the same logic, right? For example, if I get back once again to the last year sales amount, you can see that it's the same logic here. And it's the same logic here. And the only difference, as I told you previously, is the sales amount based measure, right? And if you go to the last year sales quantity, it's the sales quantity based measure. That's the only difference. Other than that, the entire logic is the same. So what is happening right here? So you can clearly see that the logic is repeating, which is not really great. And it is not the, you can clearly see that it's not the right way to go about things with calculation groups coming into play, right? So with this repetition, to avoid this repetition, what we can do is to build a calculation group with the same logic. Now, to build a calculation group, what I do is I would head back to the tabular editor. Now, if you guys had installed, if you guys do have Power BI desktop, and if you guys haven't installed Tabular Editor in your local machines, Keep in mind that the tabular editor would not show up under external tools. And if you guys don't have any other external tools, the external tools tab would not appear as well. So in order for tabular editor to show up, you need to make sure that you install tabular editor in your local machines. Installing tabular editor is really straightforward. You guys can simply Google in tabular edit download and download the tabular editor and go to the wizard and install it. And afterwards, it should typically appear in the Power BI desktop file when you open your Power BI desktop file, as you can see in the screen right now. So what I do is I would head to my tabular editor. And when I head to my tabular editor, the tabular editor would open in a window, as you can see in the screen right now. And now the tabular editor can be used for various other purposes as well, which I would not be covering in this session. What I'm focused on in this session is calculation groups. So let's see how we would create a calculation group with tabular editor. So to create a calculation group with tabular editor, I want to make sure that I head into the tables folder, which would showcase all the tables that I have in my data model. And I want to make sure that I right click on the folder and I click on right click on the folder and click on create new and head to calculation group, which would create a new calculation group in the screen, as you can see in the screen right now. Now I need to make sure that I do name my calculation group in an appropriate name. The name that I would give to my calculation group would be time intelligence. So I would call this calculation group as time intelligence. And I would simply click on the drop down icon right next to that calculation group, and I would have a look around. And when I have a look around, I do see an attribute called name. This attribute is actually used to store the calculation items which do have a logic. So this particular attribute needs to be given an appropriate name as well. So you can give an appropriate name to this particular attribute by heading into the properties panel. All you need to do is to click on this name attribute, and you can rename it here as well. And you can say this attribute as calculation, time calculation. And you can see, you can rename it there as well. And also you can head to the properties panel and you can rename your calculation group there as well. So it's entirely your preference in terms of how you want to do it. And so I had renamed my calculation, the attribute that stores the calculation group. So previously it looked something like this. It was called name, which is the attribute that would store the calculation items inside the calculation group. And I had renamed it to a meaningful name called time intelligence in this case. Sorry, time calculation in this case. And next up is the most important thing. I want to make sure that I do have the calculation items in place, right? So as in this particular use case, we have a single calculation item, right? So if I head back into the slide deck once again, and if I show you around this particular solution that you can see in the screen right now, you can see last year is a calculation item, and we had already created the calculation group time intelligence now, and we want to make sure that we create the calculation item last year inside this calculation group, right? So how do we do that? So to do that, we would head back once again into our tabular editor. As you can see in the screen right now, I would ensure that I head to the Power BI extract file as well. And the next thing what I do is I would head to the subfolder that's called calculation items, and I would right click on it and I would click on new calculation item, which would give me show me which would create a new calculation item for me. And right now I want to make sure that I provide an appropriate name to my calculation item. So in this case, the name for my calculation item would be last year, and I'd rename my calculation item that I just created as last year. And next up, we want to make sure that we store the repeating logic or the logic that's related to last year inside this last year calculation item. And how would we do that? So to do that, I would head back into my Power BI desktop file, and inside the Power BI desktop file, I would if I look at the last year's sales amount and last year's sales quantity, I can see my logic. I can pick either one of the logic, and I can simply just Control C, copy, and I can get back into my tabular editor, and I can paste this particular logic. So I want to make sure that I head to my tabular editor here. Yeah, just a moment here. Right, okay, so I am right inside my tabular editor right now. The next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I so I copied the logic from this particular Power BI desktop file from the last year sales amount measure. And what I do is I would simply do a paste. I would simply paste this particular logic that I copied. And you can also do, you can also validate your this particular logic to ensure that everything's all right. So in my case, there's nothing wrong. Everything looks all right. And also, I can also format this as per your preference. I would go to the long line preference, which would make my logic look much more decent. And next up, what I do is actually, so once again, how I formatted this is when you look at the toolbar right on top of the logic, you can see an option called Format DAX, and you can go to the long line formatting or the short line formatting as per your preference. And some accepting changes is about validating your logic just to ensure that everything's all right down there. And that's pretty much what you want to know for now to work yourself around these calculation groups. And now I had created the calculation group, and I had created the calculation item inside that calculation group as well. And I had stored the respective logic inside that calculation item as well. The next thing that I want to make sure is I want to make sure that this particular logic does cater this base measures sales amount and sales quantity. So you can see if you go through this measure, that this particular logic only caters the base measure sales amount, right? It does not cater the base measure sales quantity or any other base measure. So that is not really good, right? So we want to make sure that it's compatible with both these base measures. And to ensure that you maintain this compatibility, or to ensure that you can be flexible when using this calculation, you can in using these calculation items with various base measures, you have to use a function called selected measure, right? So that the selected measure function is nothing other than selected measure itself. So you just need to type, I would go back once again and show you that. You just need to select on the sales amount in this case, which is the specified base measure. You just need to make sure that you remove that. And instead of that, you want to make sure that you type out selected measure and have a parenthesis. And this is our selected measure function. And if I take you through what this measure actually does, it would capture whatever the logic that it would capture whatever the measure that it's fed, and it would apply the last year logic to it. For example, in other words, it would uh, capture whatever the measure that it's directed for, and it would give you the last year figure for that respective measure. So for example, if we direct the sales amount measure into this particular logic or into this particular calculation item, the sales amount measure would be captured by this selected measure function, and the last year logic would be applied, and you would get the last year sales amount figure. And if you direct the last sales quantity measure, what would happen is the last sales quantity measure would be directed, would be captured by this selected measure function, and the last year logic would be applied to the sales quantity, and you would get the last year sales quantity. So that's typically how it works out with this particular function. And there are more additional functions that you can use when you are using these calculation groups as well. There is also another measure which I will not be covering today called selected measure name, which is used to capture which measure is directed to this particular calculation item. So you can validate which measure is directed. Typically, if you can write logic to if sales amount is directed to this particular calculation item, go through the logic this way, you simply make this happen. If the sales quantity is directed, just make sure that something else does happen. I mean, you can simply capture what kind of measure is directed to this calculation item with certain measures as well. And you can simply apply the logic based on that. That's the whole point of that. So for that, you would need to use the selected measure name. And also there is another uh, function called isSelected measure. And with them, you can identify the measures that are actually fed into or directed to this calculation item, and you can work yourself around that. But in this case, we would only focus on the selected measure function, since we only need to look at just getting the last year figures for whatever the measures, whatever the base measure, where there is sales amount or sales quantity that's fed into this particular calculation item. Right. So that's the selected measure for you. And now my calculation group is all ready. And next up, what I want to do is to save my model in the tabular editor. I can just head to the file and save as well. I can also save with the shortcut that you see in the toolbar, right under file, right under the menu bar as well. So that either ways it would work out. And afterwards, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you head back into your, you want to make sure that you head back into, I would just close this out. Head back into your data model. And you want to make sure that you refresh your data model. But you don't have to refresh it. So let me have a look at what had happened here. So I had saved my model here, and I don't want to save as. I would just save it, and I would close it. And I should get an option called hopefully this refresh is not going to go through, because I do not have this data source in my local machine, I guess. Let's see how this works out, but I wouldn't. Yep. And I had closed tabular editor, and I would get back into tabular editor and see why isn't this coming up. And actually I would head back to, yeah, I do see my calculated measure right here, so no problems there. It's just that it does not appear in this particular window for some reason. Hopefully a refresh should work out. Let's see how it goes. Right, so right now I'm actually refreshing this particular window, refreshing my data model, just to make sure that my time intelligence measure would pop up. Right. Okay, so I guess that did the job. Let me have a look. Yes, it did. So yeah, so usually it's pretty unusual. I don't know why that did happen, but usually when you do save it, when you do save the model right here, you would get an yellow color option, yellow color message saying that you want to make sure that you refresh your data model, refresh the model now. And when you click on that, you would see the time intelligence measures here. And with my experience, there had been situations that without even doing a refresh, and when I actually just when I actually just created the calculation group inside the tabular editor, there are situations that when I just saved it here, there are situations that it actually popped up in the data model as well. So that was a bit of a weird situation, but all good. We have the time intelligence measure right now, which means that we are all good to go. Right. So next up, what we want to see is actually the effect of this last year measure, right? Right. To see that, I would simply have a new window, simply have a new table, bring in a new table. So what we are doing now is to see the result or the outcome of building this calculation group. Now we have, and what I do, the outcome of this time intelligence calculation group. So to do that, firstly, I brought in a table and I just had the column code here. And next up, what I do is I would have my base measure over here, which would be last year. And next up, what I do is I would, just to show you the effect of this, I would get the time calculation. You can see the time calculation, the attribute name that we renamed inside the calculation group time intelligence. So inside that, you can see the calculation item that we created, which is last year. So in this case, it appears as a table, but we want to make sure that it appears as a filter, as you can see in the screen right now, which is a slicer. So when you click on the slicer option, it would appear, the time calculation attribute would appear as a slicer from the time intelligence calculation group. And now let's just keep an eye on these figures, right? For example, let's look at so the last year figure for 2014 would be around, yeah, let me do some value formatting here. If not, it's like really confusing. Right, so you can see the last year figure is for 2014 should literally be it should be 8,802,690, right? So if we just click on the last year measure, you can see that figure for 2014 is the last year figure, which is 8,802,690. And if I just deselect it, you can see that it's the figure that you have, it's the exact figure that you have 2013. So it's typical, right? For example, for 2014, the last year is 2013. So which means the last year, the actual figure for 2013 should be the last year figure for 2014, which is 8,802,690.07. So which means that our logic is working. So there are a lot of ways in which you can play around this. I just wanted to make sure that the logic that I show you guys that this logic is working, and this is how we do it. So let's pause it from here and let's move into our demo number 2, which is just heading myself to demo number 2 here, which is the measure switch functionality, right? So to see the measure switch functionality, I would like to head back once again into our demo environment, which is the Power BI desktop file. And in the desktop file, if I look at the demo 2, you can see a report page like this. Right. Now let's think of a situation like this, where you have a report like you can see in the screen right now. which does some analytics with the sales figures, including, yeah, just wanna do some renaming here. Right, so just want to rename it to product, which is product, so that it won't confuse you. Okay, awesome. Right, so if I just take you this report page, let's think of a situation where you uh, you are a Power BI developer and you had developed this report to a set of business users to do their analytics. And this report is a report entirely that shows you visualizations that are based on sales amount, right? So it shows you on top, it shows you the sales amount by customer, sales amount by product, and this monthly sales amount as well, how it had broken down over the year. And this is typically a report, and the business users have been using it for a while. And after a while, they come up with a requirement saying that they want to do the same kind of analytics with the sales quantity as well. Now, in the very past, how we would cater this kind of a requirement is typically you would get a copy of the same report page and you would have sales quantity instead of the sales amount, and you would provide the analytics that way. Then afterwards, we started using another functionality called the switch statement to switch between the sales amount and the sales quantity measure in this case, and to provide analytical capabilities. So what happened was uh, we had a hard-coded table or a fixed table, which had the value sales amount and sales quantity. And what we did was and we had that particular column in that particular table as a filter. And based on the filter selections by the user, if the user selects sales amount, we would use the switch statement and we would typically filter out the sales amount. And if the user selects the sales quantity, uh, we would use a switch statement once again and filter out the sales quantity and show the sales quantity in the report. So that's another use case how we went about that before these calculation groups came by. Then afterwards, these calculation groups came by and made the job way more easier for us. So we can do the same thing with calculation groups as well, but in a much more easier way. So let's quickly head back into that and see how you would do that. Right, to do that, once again, I would head back into my tabular editor. So right now I'm in my tabular editor. So as usual, I want to make sure that I create a new calculation group for this purpose. So I would right click on table, create new and calculation group, and this would create a new calculation group for me. And next up, I want to make sure that I provide an appropriate name for my calculation group. So in this case, it would be measure switch. I'm just calling it measure switch, but in terms of the real world, you want to make sure that you align these names according to your requirement and how things should work out as well. So in this case, for my ease and for your ease of understanding, I just name it measure switch. And for next up, I want to make sure that I rename the attribute as well that we store the calculation items. So the attribute, I would rename it to measure name in this case. Once again, it's something that you should align based on your requirement. In this case, for your IS and for my IS, I had just I thought of going with these names. Right, so we have created the calculation group called measure switch now, and we had also renamed the attribute that stores the calculation items for measure name. And next up, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have the calculation items in place, right? So in this case, we have two key calculation items. The first calculation item is actually sales amount. Which would show you the sales amount figures. And next up, you would have another calculation item called sales quantity. which would show you the sales quantity figures. Now, next up, we want to make sure that we have the logic stored in these respective calculation items, right? So it's pretty easy. So all you need to do is head back into the sales amount measure that you have already and simply copy the logic that you have there. So in this case, it's a very basic sum for the sales amount. So there is nothing complex there. I simply get a copy of that and paste it in my tabulated calculation item. And that's about it. And I'll make sure that I validate my I'm sorry, I'll make sure that I validate my logic. So everything's all right in that front. And next up, I would head back to the sales quantity measure and I would take a copy of the sales quantity logic. Once again, a very basic sum. I would get back into the sales quantity calculation item afterwards, and I would, sorry, it's sales quantity. I would take a copy of the sales quantity and I would paste the sales quantity over here. Once again, under the calculation item. So once again, I make sure that I validate my logic, everything's good. And afterwards, I would just save my model. And after saving the model in Tabular Editor, I would head back once again to my Power BI data model and to make sure that I do have the calculation group. And if I don't, the next thing that I want to make sure do once again is to do a refresh. So in this case, you won't see a message prompting saying that you want to refresh as well, refresh the data model as well. So I would simply click on refresh, which would bring the calculation item, calculation group uh, back to my calculation group. And let's give it a while and it's actually loading. Yeah, we are done. And we can see the measure switch calculation item right now, calculation group right now in the right hand side of the screen, which means that we are all good to go. And next thing what we want to do, so if I just drop down the measure switch calculation item, you can see the attribute that we read into, which is measure name. So we are all good to go in that front. And the next thing that I want to do is to simply add uh, this particular attribute, which is under measure switch, the measure name attribute, which is under the measure switch as a slicer into my report. And that would simply do the job for me. So how I do that in this case, I don't want to waste time formatting. So I would simply get a copy of an existing slicer and I would uh, paste the slicer and just align it a little bit. And next up, what I do is I would head back into my visualization pane and field pane and make sure that I add the measure name instead of the year. So I just took a copy of the year and replaced the year with the measure name attribute, and that's about it. And next up, all you need to do is to see it in action. So to see it in action, all you need to do is simply click on each of the items. So sales amount, you won't see any difference in the first go because the report is already catering for analytics with sales amount. But if you head back to sales quantity, you can see that the figures change immediately. You can see that the sales quantities by customer, product, and also the monthly sales quantities are appearing in the report right now. And if you click back on sales amount, you would see the entire report by sales entire report by sales amount. So sales amount and sales quantity. So that's a very straightforward way of catering such a requirement. So that kind of concludes our demo number 2 for us. And next up, we would like to move into another very important use case, which is the demo number 3, which is which I call it as a relationship switch. Now, to say that, let's look at get back to see that we'll have to get back into our demo environment once again, which is the Power BI desktop file, and I would move into demo 3, and I would just get back to this report. Now, this is actually the same as the previous report. You can see analytics by the sales amount analytics by customer, product, and monthly sales breakdown. So nothing new or new right here. But now, but if you head back, to the model view of this particular reporting requirement, this is how the model looks like. Let me give you a clearer view of the model. Yeah, these are calculation groups, so they are isolated, but you can see a star schema right here, and you can see customer, product, and date are actually dimensions, and the sales is our fact table, and you can typically see how it's working out here. Now, if I take your attention to if I take your attention to this particular relationship, this particular uh, uh, if I take your attention to the sales fact table and the date dimension table, you can see that there are two relationships between the two tables, right? You have one active relationship, which is the relationship between date key and the order date key. And also there is another inactive relationship, which is between the date key and the ship date key. So what would the relationship between the date key and the order date key would give you? The relationship between the order date key and the order date key would give you order date level analytics with regard to sales, right? But when you look at the relationship between the date key and the ship date key, you would get ship date level analytics with regard to sales. So that's literally the difference between these two relationships. But you can see that the ship date to date key and the ship date key relationship is inactive, which means that you would not show, this report would not show shape date level analytics at this level, and it would only show you the order date level analytics with regard to this relationship. And while keeping that in mind, if you head back into that previous report that I just showed you, and if you look at the monthly sales breakdown, which is the line chart that you see right at the bottom, you can clearly see that for each month, the sales amount for each month is actually shown in this particular visual based on the order date level, right? Why is it the order date level? Because obviously the order date relationship is the active relationship, and the inactive relationship is the ship date relationship. And what you want to make sure is that the requirement that came up when this report was conceived was that the business user also wants to see ship date level analytics as well. In other words, the business user wants to see the monthly sales breakdown by ship date level as well. And they just don't want to see the monthly sales breakdown by just the order date level, right? And how in the past, how you would cater such a requirement is that you would have a separate measure called separate measure that would refer to the ship date level analytics, or the ship date to inactive relationship between the ship date key and the date key. And how you would access such a relationship is with a function, a very popular function actually, called use relationship. And the use relationship, if I get you into the use relationship function to much more detail, use relationship is particularly used to capture an inactive relationship, or in other words, to take use of an inactive relationship. So the inactive relationship, as you can see in the model view, is between the date key and the ship date key. And what this particular measure is doing, that I created is doing, is it's taking the sales amount with reference to the ship date key and the date key, which is the inactive relationship. In other words, just for this measure, with the use relationship function, they would make this relationship active just for this measure, and it would bring the sales amount by ship date. And how would and you would have a measure like that in the past. And what you do is you would typically have another visual around here to cater this client requirement, which is similar to this line chart. You would have another, you would simply have a similar visual right around here. And uh, the only difference that, and that measure would be actually referred to the y-axis in this line chart. And there would also be situations where you wouldn't have another visualization with ship date. This wouldn't access, and this requirement would also be catered by the same visual. In this case, the line chart. It could be catered by just adding another line into the y-axis as well. So in this case, it would show the sales amount by the order date, which is by the order date, and also the sales amount by the ship date. So you can see the dark blue one is the sales amount by ship date, how things have progressed with respect to the ship date, the sales amounts. And what you see in light blue is typically how the sales amounts have progressed with respect to the order date. So this is how this kind of a requirement would be catered in the past, but with calculation groups, this is way more easier than that. So let's see how we do this with calculation groups. And to see that, I would head back once again to the tabular editor. And if I head back to the tabular editor, what I do next is I would create a calculation group as usual. I would click on the tables folder, right click, create new, and I would go ahead to calculation group, and I have a new calculation group in place right now. And next up, I would rename my calculation group as relationship switch, which is this. And next up, I would head back into the attribute that shows the calculation items, which is named by default as name. I would rename that to relationship name. Oh yeah, relationship name. This in this case is fine, I guess. And now I have created my calculation group. I had provided an appropriate name to my calculation group. I had also renamed the attribute that I would be storing the calculation items. And next up, I want to make sure that I have my calculation items, right? So I would have two calculation items in this case. One calculation item would be called order date, which would refer to the order date relationship. And another calculation item would be ship date, which would be referring to the ship date level relationship. And the next thing that I should do is I need to make sure that I store the respective logic in this order date and ship date calculation items. So firstly, I would store the respective logic in the ship date calculated item. It's very easy to store the logic in the ship date calculation item if you have this measure already, which is the measure that you have when catering this requirement in the old fashioned way. I'll just copy that, which would have the use relationship function as well. And I would paste it. This would be typically my logic. So I had stored the logic under the ship date. And the only difference, once again, that I should do is I need to make sure that instead of having sales amount as a fixed measure or as the measure that's defined, I need to make sure that I use the selected measure function instead to capture whatever the base measures that it's directed to and to apply this kind of relation. So I would apply or use selected measure instead of the sales amount, and this would typically cater my requirement. And we had sorted out our logic for the ship date. And next up, we want to make sure that we have a similar logic for the order date, right? So for example, it would use the ship date active relationship. In this case, it would make it would use the relationship between the ship date key and the date key in this case. We want to make sure that in the order date calculation item that we do mention to use the order date key relationship and the date key relationship with the use of the selected measure function, right? So to do that, we can just take a copy of the same thing, a control C, and I would go to the order date calculation item. And the next thing that I do is I would typically paste it. Now I have pasted it. The next thing that I want to make sure is the only thing that the difference that I want to make sure is I don't want the order date calculation item to use the ship date key to date key relationship. Instead, I want to make sure that the order date calculation item would use the order date key to date key relationship, right? So instead of ship date key, I would rename it to order date key, and this would simply sort out this uh, sort things out for me. And next up, I'm all set from the calculation group end right now. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I save my model in the tabular editor. And the next afterwards, I want to make sure that I refresh the model. Once again, as I told you, you might not always need to refresh the model. There are situations that as soon as you create a calculation group in the tabular editor, it can appear in your Power BI data model as well. So it entirely depends on your situation. So yeah, that's how it would work out. Right. So that is that. And now I have my measure in place, which is the relationship switch. I have my calculation group in place, which is a relationship switch calculation group. And I will have the attribute inside my calculation group, which is the relationship name. So we are all set up. And the next thing that we want to do is just to make sure that we have the old report in place. And also we want to make sure that we have a slicer to use this relationship name, right? So to use that, I would simply take a copy of an existing slicer. In this case, it would be year. And what I do next is I would simply replace the year with the relationship name, and I would remove the year. And I would have a slicer for relationship name in this case. And all I need to do afterwards is to just switch between the order date and the ship date. So you can see that the line chart right at the bottom of this report would change according to the ship date level relationship and the order date relationship. So order date level relationship here, and then ship date level relationship. So as per the requirement of the business user, they can switch between these relationships and they can fulfill their they can get the insights that they are supposed to get. Right. So that is typically how it works out in this case. And that kind of concludes demo number 3 for me. And I have 2 more demos, which are very basic number formatting demos, but I would showcase that to you as well, because those are pretty important in terms of pretty important and useful, even though they are very minimal use cases. Right. So demo number 4 is about number formatting. It's about handling decimal places. Right. So there can be situations that in a Power BI report, there can be situations where you have, so Power BI report can be used by various business users, and you would have figures in those Power BI reports, and those figures, so those various business users might want to see these figures in different ways. For example, a, a business user A might want to see the sales amount figures by just the whole numbers without any decimal places, which is by 0 decimal places. Then the business user B might want to see the sales amount with the first decimal place. And the business user C might want to see the sales amount by the second decimal place. So various requirements, right? How you would cater these requirements in the past is by having separate measures and formatting those measures as per those requirements and showing them whenever they are required. And also this was also used with the switch statement as well, once again, which is a switch statement that we discussed previously. What we do is once again we'd have a very fixed table saying with a column saying first decimal place, second decimal place, third decimal place, and so on and so on. And what we do is we would use a switch statement, and based on next up, we would have that column in the fixed table as a slicer. And as per the slice selection by the business user, we would write a switch statement that would typically give you the first decimal place figures, second decimal place figures, and so on. So that is typically one way we cater that requirement as well. But most of the time, how we used to cater this requirement is by having each measure, having a measure for each decimal place that's required, and have showing those measures wherever that's required for the respective business users. This is actually very, I would say, once again, this is actually unnecessary. We are just creating the same measure multiple times just for the formatting purposes, right? This does not sound right, and this is not the right way to go about things. So with calculation groups, this use case had ease for us, been very easy for us to cater. How we would usually do is we would have a calculation group. So to have a calculation group, once again, I would head back into my tabular editor. And in my tabular editor, I would right click on the tables and I would create new and create a calculation group. And this calculation group, I would call it as decimals handling. Just giving a random name that I feel at the moment. But as I told you previously, when you are doing this in the real world, make sure that you identify and align with the situation and the business users as well. Make sure that it's comforting enough for them uh, to use and identify these measures as well. Right, next up, I would head back into the attribute that would show my calculation items. And in this attribute, I would rename it to decimal place. Right, now I have my calculation group named as the decimals handling, and I have renamed the attribute to show the calculation items as decimal place. And next up, I want to make sure that I have the calculation items. So in this case, should have three calculation items. First one is no decimal places. And the second one is first decimal place. And the third one is second decimal place. Right. Now I have my calculation groups item set up. Next up, I just want to make sure that I have the logic stored inside these calculation items. In this case, I don't have a very specific logic. I just want to make sure that I have selected measure function used just to capture whatever the measures that are directed to. And I want to make sure that I would rename this particular calculation item. It doesn't look right. It's a spelling mistake. Sorry about that. And I would move back. I would simply copy and paste the same uh, selected measure function for all these three calculation items because we don't want to play around with any kind of logic. We just want to make sure that we just capture whatever the measures that it's directed to. Right, now we have that in place and we are all good in that front. And next up, we want to make sure that we format this with these figures with our respective decimal places. And how I do that is with the format string, how I do that is I would select on a calculation item, in this case, the no decimal place calculation item. And when I do select that, I would see a properties pane in the bottom right hand side of the screen. And what I need to pay attention to is the format string expression item that you see, property that I see right here. And how you format strings here is that typically you want to format the numeric figures here is you want to make sure that you have quotations in place. And inside those quotations, you just want to mention your figure. For example, if you want your figures to show up as with no decimal places, you just mention 0. And if you want your figures to show up with one decimal place, it should be 0.0. And if you want your figures to show up with 2 decimal places, it should be 0.00. So in this case, it's no decimal places, which means it would be 0. And that's about it. And I would move back to the first decimal place and do the same thing, format string expressions, open quotations, close quotations, 0.0. And that's about it. And afterwards, I would move to the second decimal place. And in the second decimal place, I would do something similar as well, 0.00. And I have my formatting set up. And next up, I would save this my model in tabular editor, and seems like my calculation group hadn't appeared. And so what I want to do is I want to make sure that I refresh my data model once again so that my calculation group would appear. Right, so my model is refreshing right now, and it's almost done. So let's give it 2 minutes till we actually let the calculation group execute. Right, all done. Let the model refresh. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we are all done, and we do have the decimals handling calculation group in our data model right now. So we are all set. The next thing that we want to do is to see the effect of this. Let's bring down a card, and that card would have our base measure sales amount. There you go, sales amount. So the sales amount, as you can see in the screen right now, is in 2 decimal places. And what I do next is I would bring in a slicer, and I would use the decimal place attribute inside the decimals handling calculation group as for this slicer. And I would select each of the options that you have in this calculation calculation group, which are select each of the calculation items that I have inside this calculation group, and you can clearly see the effect of that. For example, no decimal places, the value would round up to 14.69 million, would round up to 15 million, and it would show you the figure. And for two decimal places, so obviously it would be the 14.69 million figure. And for 1 decimal place, it would round up to 14.7 million, and it would show you the figure. So you can simply see the effect of this calculation group that we just created, right? So it's very straightforward and nothing special over there. So that's about it. And this would take us to the final number formatting demo, and which would be the final demo for the day, which would simply wrap up my session. And this is simply a number formatting with regard to handling blanks and zeros. Right. So there can be situations that you would have blanks like you have in the screen right now. Yep. Let me. Yeah, just showing you the blanks over here. You would have blanks, and like you have there can be situations that this is actually another experience that I had as well. So there can be situations that when you introduce or when you showcase cards in your Power BI reports, if you don't have figures for that, it would show up as blank. And when the business user sees this, and they wouldn't like it much, and they want to make sure that these blanks are replaced with 0. So how you would do that is you would have a separate measure for these cards, and you would have this measure that would display zeros, as you can see in the screen right now. A separate measure, and this particular, if I take you to that particular measure, it would use just a coalesce function, and it would simply refer to the sales amount figure in this case, and ensure that if the sales amount is blank, it would the zero would show up instead. And that way, once again, and that is specifically for the card visuals, how you would cater that kind of a requirement. But when it comes to tables, you want to make sure that you cannot have the zeros this way, because then there would be unnecessary records that would be coming in the tables. Instead, you want to make sure that that the values that does not exist show up as blank, which would cut down the unnecessary records from tabular views such as tables and metrics. So you want to make sure that you maintain both these measures and use it as per your requirement before calculation groups came into play, right? So that once again, you are creating measures unnecessary to cater this similar requirements in different ways. This can be once again avoided with the use of calculation groups. For this, we can once again use a calculation group. So to use a calculation group for this requirement, I would head back into the tabular editor once again, and I would head back into the folder tables and create new calculation group. And I would make sure that I rename my calculation group in an appropriate name. In this case, I would call this, yeah, I would just call it whatever I feel. I would call it blanks handling. And afterwards, I would head to the attribute that shows the calculation items. And this attribute, I would rename it to uh, uh, blank type. And next up, I would create the calculation items. In this case, I have two calculation items. One calculation item is 0, and the other calculation item is blank. Right. So to make sure that my values appear as 0, I want to use coalesce as per the function that you see, as per what you see in the screen, as per the function that I had used with the measure in the screen right now. So what I do is I would simply copy this measure and I would paste it. I would make sure that I head into the uh, calculation item 0, and I would paste that logic inside the calculation item 0. And I would make sure that instead of using say sales amount, I would use selected measure instead. And that would be typically uh, uh, that would typically be the logic that would give me a 0 with regard to whatever the measure that it's directed to. And blank, you got nothing to do with it. You just need to make sure that you have the selected measure to capture whatever the measure that comes in. And that's typically about it. And next up, what I do is I would save the model in the tabular editor, and I would simply refresh the data model as I don't see the calculation group that I just created. And my model is refreshing right now, and I think we are all good to go. Right, we are all good. And you should be able to see the blanks handling calculation group in the right hand side of the screen now, which with the attribute name blank type, which we had previously. And to see the effect of this, what I do is I would remove these two cards that I have already. And next up, I would just bring in a brand new card where sales amount. And you can see the sales amount is blank by default. And next up, I'd make sure that I bring in the blank type attribute under the blanks handling calculation group as a measure as a slicer. So I had done that. And next up, what I do is I would just so you can see the calculation items blank and 0 that we just created under this particular blank type attribute. And when you select on each of them, you can simply see the effect of the blanks and zeros, right? Whenever you want to see 0, click on 0 and the 0 should pop up. And whenever you want to see blank, click on blank and the blank will pop up. So 0, blank, 0, blank. And that's typically how it works out. And that actually concludes my session today. So Deepankar, once again, thank you very much for having me in, and Arthur as well. It's a privilege to speak at the Toronto Data Professionals Community. Thank you very much for having me in, Deepankar, once again. And also don't forget to provide me with feedback by scanning through the QR code that you see in the screen right now. Your feedback is actually really important for me in order to improve my speaking and in order to improve my contributions to the community. I just want to make sure that I contribute to the community better as in my level best. So yeah, please do provide me with your support. So thank you very much, Deepanka and Arthur, and thank you very much, guys, for participating. And thank you very much.
Hey, yep. Thank you so much, Samantha, for your, valuable content and sharing your knowledge. And this is really great. I enjoyed it. Hopefully everyone did so. Also, especially someone also asking your contact. And I think, I will share this video as well as this content through the email. So you'll have all the information about Timantha. So if you'd like to reach to him or any question you may have, you can, ask him directly. Um, yeah, that's it. And thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening, and thank you so much, Timantha, again. And yeah, so we can say bye now. Bye for today.
Thank you very much, everyone, and have a happy vacation. Deepanka, I hope you would enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, Arthur. Okay, yeah, bye.